The world knows my stage, my voice, and my name as a global brand. But before I was the woman the world listens to, I was a girl the world tried to silence. I wasn't born for success. Statistically, I was born to be a statistic. Poor, Black, in segregated Mississippi, the daughter of a single mother. I had everything it took to be forgotten, but I decided to be unforgettable. My name is Oprah Winfrey, and this is the story of how I turned my wounds into my greatest fortune. I was born on January 29, 1954, in Kosciuszko, Mississippi, in a world that seemed too small to dream big. I started life in a reality that, for many people, looks like a scene from an old movie. Dirt roads, heat, poverty, hard labor, and a kind of silence all around, as if the world were saying, stay in your place. The truth is, I came into this world in a complicated situation. My mother was very young. My father and mother didn't make up a traditional family, the kind you see in commercials. For a long time, I was more of a child someone could look after than a child of a single home. In my early years, the one who raised me was my grandmother. She was firm. One of those women who didn't ask reality for permission. She just stared it down. And I remember her in a simple dress, hands always busy, and a look that said two things at the same time. I love you, and the world isn't going to spare you. Many people talk about me as the woman who won, but I always think I was a girl who learned early on how to endure. The house had no luxury at all. Sometimes what we had was the bare minimum of the basics, and yet my grandmother had a wealth. She taught me to read very early. When I was really small, before I was 3, I was already handling words as if they were toys. And that wasn't common, not for a poor Black girl in Mississippi. My grandmother took me to church, and the church became my first stage. I can see myself, small, dressed up as best we could manage, with people looking at me like I was a promise. I would go up front and recite verses, poems, Bible passages, and the people's reaction, I never forgotten it. I could hear the ladies whispering and fanning their faces with makeshift fans. That girl is different. Hattie Mae. That child is gifted, and I held on to that. I stored it away like food for hungry days. But while I was getting applause in church, my life outside of it was hard. When you're born into poverty, there's a humiliation that doesn't need words. It presents itself on its own. Sometimes it's in your clothes. Sometimes it's in the way people look at you. I remember kids laughing at me, comments, me trying to pretend I didn't care. And then I learned one thing very early on. I had two options. Either I accepted the story the world wanted to give me, or I wrote a new one. I didn't know how yet, but I already knew what. I wanted a bigger life. When I was 6 years old, my life changed scenery. I left that rural environment and went to live with my mother in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And if anyone imagines that living with mom automatically means comfort, it's not always like that. My mother worked a lot, a whole lot. She did what she could to survive. And when an adult is trying not to drown, the child often learns not to get in the way. Milwaukee was something else. More noise, more people, more rush. And I was a girl trying to decipher the world all over again. I wanted attention, but didn't know how to ask. I wanted comfort, but got used to going without. I wanted safety, and that was when life introduced me to its cruelest side. I won't go into heavy details, because that's not what this is about, but I need to tell the truth. I suffered abuse as a child. It was a sequence of experiences that started when I was very young, and that took me years to be able to name out loud. There's something that happens to a child when they go through this. They start to feel guilty for existing. They start to think silence is safer than the truth. I carried shame before I even understood what shame was. And for a while, that messed everything up inside me. I became a girl with two versions. The one who smiled on the outside and the one who screamed on the inside. I had moments of rebellion, of running away, of confusion. There was a point where I seemed to be heading in the wrong direction, as if life were pulling me to a place of no return. And in the middle of that whirlwind, at 14, I got pregnant. The baby was born premature and didn't survive. It was a silent grief mixed with fear and shame at an age when I barely knew how to take care of myself. I remember looking at the ceiling and thinking, that's it. Now it's over. Now no one will ever respect me. Now I am just this. And it's strange, because there are people who look at my story today and think I was born with a light. No, I didn't be born with a light. I was born with questions. And one of them was, God, do you still see me? That was when my life changed again. I was sent to Nashville to live with my father. I was a teenager, and I arrived there as a wounded, suspicious girl trying to look tough. My father was different. He had a type of love that didn't come wrapped in sweetness. It came wrapped in expectation. I remember the first clash with him. I arrived, dropped my things, and tried to act like nothing could touch me. He looked at me, serious, and said something in his tone, firm, direct. In this house, you are going to study. You are going to read. You are going to learn to be someone. I wanted to talk back. I wanted to say, you don't own me. I wanted to make a scene. I wanted to run. But for some reason, I felt that a chance existed there. And he wasn't just talk. He set rules, routine, responsibility. I won't romanticize it. Sometimes I hated it. Teenagers hate rules. I remember one night when I complained, slumped in a chair, with that posture of, nobody understands me. Why are you so hard on me? And he answered, without raising his voice, because I am not going to lose you to the world. That sentence, I never forgot it. In Nashville, I started to rebuild my mind. My father valued education as if it were a passport, and for me, it was. I started to have hope again in the simplest way, through small victories, a good grade, a teacher giving a compliment, a feeling of, maybe I'm not condemned. I got involved with speaking activities, theater, oratory. I had one thing that, even when my life was in ruins, hadn't died, my voice. And voice, when it meets discipline, becomes destiny. I started participating in contests, events, anything that put me in front of people. And little by little, I started realizing, when I spoke, people listened. Not because I was perfect, but because I was real, and that is worth gold. I also got in touch with radio. I was fascinated by the idea of someone speaking and reaching people they don't even know. It was almost magical. I remember walking into a station and smelling the place. Equipment, paper, stale coffee, an energy of urgency. And I thought, my God, so this is where life happens. I went to study at Tennessee State University on a scholarship, but the truth is, my heart was already pulling toward communication and media. I wanted to work with this, live off this, and at some moment, I made a decision that gives me butterflies just to remember. I wasn't going to wait for the perfect time. I was going to start. I was 19 when I became a news anchor at a local station, the youngest person in that role, and also a milestone as a Black woman in that position in Nashville. Now, imagine this scene with me, a girl, Black, coming from poverty, with scars no one saw, sitting in front of a camera, script in hand, trying to look professional, while inside I was thinking, don't mess up, don't mess up, don't mess up. Back then, it wasn't just about reading the news, it was about proving I belonged there. I remember a moment when someone in the hallway, I won't say who because that kind of thing is bigger than one person, dropped a comment with that poison disguised as an opinion. You actually speak well, actually. There's always an actually when the world measures you by an unfair ruler. I took a breath, smiled out of politeness, and thought, you're going to have to handle me with class. But even achieving a dream, I realized something fast. Traditional journalism demanded an objectivity that suffocated me. I wanted to feel, I wanted to ask, I wanted to look in the eye and understand what was behind the news. I didn't want to be a fact machine. I wanted to be a bridge between people. And that desire kept guiding me. In 1976, I went to work in Baltimore as a reporter and co-anchor at an ABC affiliate. And there I felt again that tension. The world telling me, be cold, and me being me. I tried to follow the script of what they expected from an anchor, but I was emotional, human, curious. I wanted to talk like people talk. And that, in a rigid environment, seemed like a flaw. But it was in Baltimore that I found a door that seemed to have my name on it. A talk show, looser, closer to people. When I started seeing myself in that format, talking, listening, reacting for real, I felt something I had barely felt since I was a child. Alignment. As if everything I had lived, including the pain, had a reason. As if I had been trained by life to understand people without judging them so quickly. I remember walking out of the studio one day and thinking, this is it. It's here. And that was how I started getting closer to what the world would come to know later. But at that moment, it was just a young woman trying to survive and grow. I wasn't Oprah yet, the way the planet says it. I was just Oprah trying to become someone she herself respected. And to be honest, that was already hard enough. I stayed in Baltimore long enough to understand two things at the same time. First, that I had found a place where my nature, curious, emotional, human, wasn't a flaw. And second, that I still hadn't learned to protect myself from the weight other people's stories can place inside us. On television, especially back then, there was an expectation for you to be flawless, controlled, neutral. But I wasn't neutral. I looked at someone talking about their life and thought, what is this person not managing to say? I wanted to get there. I wanted to touch what was real. That was why, when I left the news and went to a local talk show, I felt like I was finally breathing. In Baltimore, I hosted a show called People Are Talking, and there, I started to understand the power of a conversation done right. And it was also in Baltimore that life gave me a quiet gift, a friendship that would become part of my story forever. I met Gayle King when we were still young. She worked at the station, and we bumped into each other in that busy backstage world. One day there was a snowstorm. I remember the cold as if it had seeped into my bones, and I saw Gayle with nowhere to go, stuck there because of the weather. I looked and said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, "You can stay at my place." She stared at me as if I had just opened a door she didn't even know existed. "Really, Oprah? Really? It doesn't make sense for you to stay stuck here." And there, without a pretty speech, without a promise, without ceremony, a bond was born. Over time, people would look at our friendship and try to label it every which way, because a lot of people don't understand two women being deeply loyal to one another without any interest beyond the love of friendship. But that was one of my pillars. But while I was building space on television, I was also building courage, because growing up how I grew up always leaves you with a feeling of this could end at any moment. And sometimes when you feel that, you work double, not to win, but not to lose. And then in 1983, early 1984, the phone rang with the kind of invitation that changes the course of a life. It was Chicago. The proposal was for me to take over a low-rated morning show called AM Chicago on WLS-TV. I was the girl from Baltimore, and they were losing badly to the competition. A man named Dennis Swanson, who ran the station, wanted to bet on me. When I hung up, I stared at nothing for a few seconds. I didn't have a safety net. I wasn't an heir to anything. I didn't have a comfortable plan B. I only had my intuition and my willingness to work. I called my father. He was still that firm voice in my head, even when I was already an adult. "Dad, they offered me Chicago." One. On the other end of the line, a short silence, as if he were weighing the heaviness of the word. "Chicago is big, I know. Then act like a grown-up." I laughed because he was like that. He didn't come with a verbal hug. He came with direction. "Are you going?" I took a deep breath. "I'm going." The day I arrived in Chicago, I felt like I was entering a city that wasn't going to handle me with care, and I was right. Chicago has that prove it energy. Prove you deserve it. Prove you can take it. Prove you're good. I remember the first day like a fast-forward sequence. Makeup, bright lights, the crew assessing me in silence, the clock ticking, and me with that obsessive thought that had followed me since I was a teenager. Don't mess up. My first episode of AM Chicago aired on January 2nd, 1984. And let me tell you something a lot of people don't imagine. When you take over a dying show, there are always people rooting for you to be just an experiment that didn't work out. There are people who want to say, "See? She wasn't all that." I felt that in the air, but I also felt a freedom because if it was already bad, I could try it my way. I had no interest in looking like a porcelain anchor. I wanted to talk like I talked in real life. I wanted to laugh when it was funny, get serious when it was serious, get emotional when it touched me. I wanted to be human during business hours. In the beginning, the show had to fight for ratings. And yes, television back then loved sensationalism. Sometimes the topics were too flashy, too exaggerated, too loud, and I learned right there, hands-on, that ratings are a language, but they're not a purpose. The audience responded fast. In a few months, the show went from last place to the most watched local talk show in Chicago, even surpassing Donahue in the city. I remember someone from the team coming up with numbers in hand, eyes wide, like they were saying, "It's not possible." "Oh, Oprah, did you see this?" And I took the paper, read it, and for a few seconds I couldn't celebrate. I just felt relief. A relief so big it almost hurt, because deep down, the girl I used to be always believed that good things would be taken away from her. And when they weren't taken away, I started to change on the inside. It was during this phase that I started thinking differently about control. I started to understand that if I depended only on other people's decisions, I would always be vulnerable. I had seen that too much in life. I had lived that too much in childhood. I didn't want to repeat that pattern in my career. And that was when I started paying attention to a word that back then, few people in television wanted a host to speak: ownership. Who runs the show? Who decides what's in and what's out? Who keeps the value of what is created? And while I was living this turning point in Chicago, something else happened that seemed unlikely. I was called to act in a movie. In 1985, I was in The Color Purple, directed by Steven Spielberg, based on Alice Walker's book. I always say that role went through me. I didn't walk into that movie as a Hollywood star. I walked in as a woman who knew pain, who understood silence, who understood humiliation, and who also understood strength. And look, I'm not going to pretend I was calm. I remember being on set and thinking, what am I doing here in the middle of these people? I'm a TV host. There was a moment when I said to someone, venting, kind of laughing nervously, "I'm going to ruin everything." And the answer was simple, the kind that changes your posture. You just need to be real. I was. The movie was nominated for many awards, and I received an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actress for that role. And, at the same time, I went back to Chicago with a new perception. I wasn't just a communicator. I could be a producer, a creator, an owner of my destiny. Around 1985, the local show was already so strong that it became practically inevitable, putting my name in the title. AM Chicago became known as the Oprah Winfrey Show, but the biggest step was still coming. I remember hearing the talk about going national as if it were a distant dream, and at the same time, a trap. Because going national seemed glamorous, but it could also mean losing control, losing identity, becoming someone else's product. And that was when key people around me started pushing the idea hard. One of the most well-known stories from this time involves film critic Roger Ebert, who reportedly encouraged me to accept national syndication. The truth is, when you're standing in front of a giant door, it's not just excitement you feel fear too. Fear of failing in public, fear of becoming a national joke, fear of being too big and not fitting inside yourself anymore. I took this to a conversation with Gail because she was always my safe place to talk without makeup. What if I can't handle it? She looked at me with that sweet firmness of hers and dropped something I needed to hear. You've handled worse things with no cameras at all. Now you're going to handle it with cameras. There's no arguing with that. So I signed a syndication deal, and the show premiered nationally on September 8, 1986, distributed by King World. And when I say life changed, I mean that suddenly I wasn't just talking to Chicago anymore. I was talking to America. I remember the feeling of the first day with national reach as if it were a weight on my chest. I knew that from then on, every gesture of mine was going to be analyzed. Every word was going to echo. And when you grow up without protection, you learn to anticipate attack. But there was also another feeling, one of mission, because I realized a microphone isn't just an object. A microphone is a destiny when it falls into the right hand. And in that moment, I was still learning what my right way would be. I needed to sustain a daily show with a huge audience, with commercial pressure, with unrealistic expectations. And at the same time, I felt a shift inside me. I didn't want to do just what grabbed attention anymore. I wanted to do what transformed. It was during this phase that I made another decision a lot of people didn't understand. I was going to build my own structure. In 1986, I created Harpo Productions. Harpo is Oprah spelled backwards, as a way to have more control over what I created and over the direction of my work. I remember people in the industry saying, directly or indirectly, that it was too bold. You're a host, Oprah, as if a host couldn't be an owner, as if a black woman couldn't sign her own trajectory. And I answered with work. I worked as if every episode were a brick, because that's what it was. I was building a house I could call mine. At that time, the show's agenda was still a mix of everything. Daytime television had that hunger for drama, for conflict, for stories that made an impact. And I, honestly, was discovering along the way where the border lay between entertainment and exploitation. It's hard to admit this, but it's part of the truth. I also made mistakes while learning. I also got pulled by industry trends. I also had to look in the mirror at some point and think, is this really what I want to put out into the world? And while I was making this adjustment on the inside, I was also expanding on the outside. In 1989, I acted in and also produced a major project for TV, The Women of Brewster Place. And in 1990, I took another step forward, creating a structure for film, Harpo Films. All of this wasn't just professional growth. It was, for me, an attempt to break a cycle. Because I had seen, since I was a girl, how easy it is for someone to take from you what you couldn't protect. I didn't want the adult Oprah to live the same fragility as the child Oprah. And in the middle of that construction, I never forgot where I came from. Sometimes, late at night, after filming, after meetings, after arguing contracts and percentages and deadlines, I would be alone and catch myself thinking about that little girl in Mississippi reciting in church. I could almost hear my grandmother's voice, as if she were right there beside me. Use your voice right, and I would answer softly, as if she could hear, I'm trying. Because that's what my life became in that period, a daily attempt, trying to be big without being empty, trying to have power without losing my soul, trying to become a brand without ceasing to be a person. And what I didn't know yet, but I was about to find out, was that the next phase would demand an even higher level of responsibility from me. Because when millions are watching you, you don't just change your life, you change the culture. I remember that when the show went national and my name started becoming a phenomenon, a lot of people thought I had reached a kind of happy ending, but inside, I knew. I had only reached a new kind of beginning. Because when you realize millions of people are watching you, a strange thing happens. You feel pride, and at the same time, you feel fear. Fear of becoming a caricature, fear of losing yourself, fear of waking up one day and realizing you're living to please the market and not to honor your truth. And I didn't want that. I was building Harpo. I was learning about contracts, rights, ownership, production. And even so, there was a void that sometimes showed up at the end of the day. I had success, but I was still a person trying to understand herself. There was one night, already late, when I was alone in my office, looking at a stack of papers and numbers, and I thought, all this is big, but what am I feeding here? Is my soul growing along with it? My team started noticing I was restless. A producer, in a careful tone, asked me, "What's wrong, Oprah? Aren't you happy?" "The show is doing very well." I took a breath and said what I had been swallowing for months. "I don't want just ratings. I want meaning." And when I said that, I felt like I had crossed an invisible line, as if I had finally admitted to myself that I couldn't just be a host chasing numbers. I needed to be a person chasing purpose. Back then, daytime television could be very loud. Sometimes it was tempted to turn people into a spectacle, and I realized I didn't want to use other people's pain as entertainment. I wanted to honor that pain, transform it into learning, into healing, into something that lifted the person up instead of crushing them. I also started to understand that I needed to look at my own life with more courage, because I had already told things publicly, but there were still parts of me I treated like a locked room. And I had another old battle, my body. I always talk about this with honesty because I know how much this messes with us, especially with women. My weight went up, went down, and every variation seemed to become a headline. It wasn't just physical change, it was judgment. It was people thinking they had the right to decide what I was worth based on my size. There was a moment when I thought, I'm done being a hostage to this. And I threw myself into routines, diets, discipline. I went as far as doing things that today, looking back calmly, I see as part of my attempt to control life from some angle. Because when you couldn't control the pain back then, you try to control anything within reach. In one of those periods, I lost a lot of weight and made a gesture that became famous. I walked on stage pushing a wagon full of fat to show how much I had lost. At the time, I thought it was a strong way of saying, I can do it. But over time, I came to understand that our relationship with our body doesn't fit into a TV trick. It's deeper. It's emotional. It's history. And I started learning, little by little, to stop punishing myself and start listening to myself. I was also discovering what it was like to have a love life in front of the public. I met Stedman Graham, and our relationship started at a time when my life was already very exposed. And there's something people don't understand. When the world watches you, it thinks it can demand a script from you. House. Marriage, baby. Happy ending the way I imagine it. And I learned in practice that you need to live your life with honesty, not with other people's expectations. There was a day when someone, without any embarrassment, asked me, Oprah, when are you getting married? And I answered laughing, but with a kind of firmness behind it. When I want to. If I want to. Stedman and I actually got engaged in the early 90s, and it turned into a circus. I felt like every person in the country was weighing in on my intimacy, and I realized that for me, commitment didn't need the spectacle. I wanted love with peace, not love as a headline. And while I reorganized my life on the inside, a beautiful thing was happening on the outside. I was finally creating the show format I always dreamed of. There was a clear turning point. I remember it like it was now. I sat down with the team and said, from today on, I don't want to do television that humiliates anymore. I want to do television that elevates. One of the producers looked at me worried. But what about the ratings? And I answered in the simplest way. The audience will follow me if I'm real. And if they don't follow, then I'd rather lose numbers than lose myself. That decision changed everything. I started bringing deeper conversations. I started talking about overcoming, trauma, choices, spirituality, forgiveness, books, self-knowledge. I started inviting people who inspired, not just people who shocked. And I also started to understand that my voice wasn't just a voice, it was a bridge. In 1993, I lived one of those moments where you realize you are at the center of the culture. I interviewed Michael Jackson, and that was gigantic. It wasn't just an interview, it was an event. The pressure was surreal because everyone wanted answers, secrets, reactions, sound bites. Before going on air, I remember taking a deep breath and thinking, don't make this a circus, make this a conversation. At some point, backstage, I said to him, trying to break the ice, people don't see you as an ordinary man. And he, with a look that mixed tiredness and gentleness, answered something that stayed with me. I wish they did. It was a night that taught me a lot about fame. about loneliness, about how the world turns human beings into symbols and then feels entitled to judge the symbol as if it didn't bleed. And that kind of understanding started to shape not just my show, but my stance on life. In that same decade, I also learned about courage in another area: business. I was already growing as a producer, investing in content, building studios, a team, a structure. And growing at that level means attracting not just applause, but attacks. One of the hardest episodes was when I spoke on the show about a topic that was in the news and generated panic in a lot of people: the mad cow issue and meat safety. I expressed concerns, as many people did at that time, and that generated a huge reaction. I was sued by representatives of the Texas cattle industry, and it turned into a long, public, heavy battle. There was a day when I walked out of a hearing and sat in the car feeling my heart beating in my throat. I looked out the window and thought, this is it. This is how they try to silence you. My lawyer asked me, do you want to ease up? Do you want to take back anything you said? And I answered with the conviction I found throughout life: I am not going to live in fear. In the end, I won that lawsuit. But the real lesson was different. When you have a big platform, you need to use it responsibly. And at the same time, you need to accept that there will always be someone trying to control what you can or cannot say. It was also in the 90s that I did something I consider one of the most influential moves of my career. I created a book club. It might seem simple today, but back then, turning books into a popular topic, into lunch conversation, into a national fever, that was almost unthinkable. I remember the first announcement. I was in the studio, held up a book, and told the audience, with true excitement, I want us to read together. I want us to talk about it. I want us to grow together. And I saw something in people's eyes that moved me. Thirst. Thirst for stories. Thirst for meaning. Thirst to see themselves in the pages. I saw people saying, I haven't read a whole book in years, and I would answer, then let's start now. Suddenly, books became bestsellers because we were reading as a community. Authors gained space, publishers scrambled, and I thought, look at that. Television can do this. It can bring depth into people's homes. Around the same time, I took a risk in cinema again with a project that marked me. I produced and acted in Beloved, based on Toni Morrison's work. It wasn't an easy path, and not everyone embraced that movie the way I hoped. But for me, that was bigger than box office numbers. It was about telling stories that mattered. It was about giving body and voice to a historical pain, to memories that were often pushed into the dark. And as the years went by, I kept expanding what people called the Oprah empire. But I always tried to remember, I didn't want an empire for vanity. I wanted impact. I created charity projects, started structuring initiatives for giving, scholarships, disaster relief, community support. Because to me, money without purpose becomes a burden. And I knew what it was like to be in need. I knew what it was like to be the child who didn't have. So when I could, I wanted to give back. And in the middle of all this, I started surrounding myself with people who fed my spirit. I met and got close to names that became references in my journey. Writers, thinkers, spiritual leaders, people who spoke about healing in a way that wasn't superficial. And I opened myself up very publicly to the idea that there is an inner life just as important as the outer one. There was a day I talked to someone I admired a lot, a kind of mentor to me, and I vented, sometimes I feel like I'm carrying the world. And she answered with a firm calm, then stop carrying it, start serving. The world doesn't need you to carry it. It needs you to be a vessel. That went right through me because I realized I had confused responsibility with weight. I thought that to be useful, I needed to exhaust myself, and I started to learn another way, doing things with presence without destroying myself. As the show went on, I also learned to deal with criticism because when you become big, you become a target. You become a screen where people project love and hate. I heard everything. That I was too nice, that I was too bossy, that I was too emotional, that I was too powerful. And at some point, I laughed to myself and thought, if I'm being too much for everyone, then maybe I'm just being me. By the late 90s and entering the 2000s, I was already in a position where I could make decisions that would have been impossible before. I could expand my production, consolidate my company, structure new projects, and also start planning something I couldn't even imagine at the start of my career, a legacy that went beyond my daily presence on TV. And yet, inside, I kept trying to answer a simple question that had followed me since the girl from Mississippi. How can I use my voice the right way? Because I never forgot what it is not to be heard. I never forgot what it is to be invisible. I never forgot what it is to feel that no one is coming to save you. So, If life gave me a microphone, I wanted that microphone to be an extended hand. I entered the 2000s with a curious feeling. I had already reached places the girl from Mississippi didn't dare imagine. But I didn't want my life to become just a repetition of success. I wanted to grow on the inside at the same speed I was growing on the outside. And it was around that time that I felt a very strong impulse to create something that was more intimate, more like home. Less just TV and more companionship. I remember being in a meeting with magazine people, a table full of ideas, covers, titles, debates about what sells and what doesn't sell. And I was very direct because I've always been like that when I know what I want. I don't want a magazine that makes a woman feel like less. I want a magazine that makes a woman feel like more. Someone asked, more what? And I answered, more alive, more capable, more in charge of herself. That's how the idea for what the world came to know as O, the Oprah magazine, was born, launching in 2000. I didn't just want to put my face on covers. I wanted to put conversation on the kitchen table. I wanted someone, anywhere, to open a page and feel I am not alone. It was also in this phase that I realized something. I wasn't just a person with a show anymore. I had turned into a kind of platform, and a platform without a heart is just an empty stage. I created and supported giving initiatives, education projects, support programs for people who were invisible to many. I always repeated to myself, you know what it is to need. Don't forget that. And even so, I won't lie. The more you grow, the more you are tested. There was a period when my show was so big that anything that happened there had an immediate impact. That is beautiful and dangerous. I remember a time when a book chosen by my book club became a national controversy. I had recommended a work because it had moved me, and later it came out that parts of the story weren't exactly how they had been presented. The discussion took on huge proportions. A lot of people wanted me to gloss over it. A lot of people wanted me to destroy someone, and I stood in the middle of that storm thinking, what is responsibility when you have influence? I'm not perfect. I made mistakes. I learned. I had to look at my own enthusiasm and understand that sometimes my love for a story cannot replace my duty to the truth. And then, in 2005, a scene happened that the whole world commented on for years, an interview that spun out of emotional control. A guest, famous, charismatic, explosive, got carried away, and I saw the conversation turn into a kind of spectacle. I was there, smiling, trying to steer, trying to keep it on the rails, and thinking inside, okay, Oprah, breathe. Hold the room. Later, backstage, someone from production told me, this is going to be the topic of the planet. And I answered in the simplest way, then let it be. But I hope people also learn that emotion without awareness becomes chaos. In that same decade, one of the deepest decisions of my life was taking shape. My commitment to girls' education. The idea of building a school in South Africa wasn't born as a whim. It was born from an old question. If I could go back in time and help the child Oprah, what would I give her? I would give her teachers who believed in her. I would give her safety. I would give her books. I would give her a beautiful place. Because beauty also educates. Beauty teaches that you deserve good things. I remember talking about this and, at some point, meeting Nelson Mandela and feeling something I can't explain properly. He had a presence that seemed to calm the air. And when I spoke about the desire to invest in education, I felt that it wasn't just a project, it was a calling. Years later, in 2007, when the school finally opened, I stood before those girls and felt something that caught me off guard. An almost maternal love, a pride, a fear too, because I knew that when you promise to transform lives, you need to be ready to sustain the promise with actions, not with speeches. I looked at them and said something I wish someone had said to me when I was little. You are not what happened to you, you are what you choose to become. And yet, not everything was simple. There were challenges, criticisms, moments when I needed to deal with internal problems, with real pains of real teenagers, with responsibilities that don't show up in pretty photos. And I learned that charity is not an event. Charity is a continuous commitment. Getting closer to 2010, I had already been speaking to the public every day for decades. And there was a moment when I sat alone, in silence, and asked myself, are you going to do this forever? The answer came as a feeling, not as a sentence, but it was clear. I needed to close that cycle with dignity. I announced that the Oprah Winfrey Show would end in 2011. And I remember the day I said that out loud and felt the studio change. Because people weren't just watching a show end. They were saying goodbye to a habit, a companion, an emotional routine. After the announcement, someone asked me, why stop? when you're still on top? And I answered something that came from deep down. Because I want to choose my life. I don't want my life to choose for me. The last year of the show was a roller coaster. I did special episodes, I gave thanks, I cried, I laughed, I revisited memories, and I tried, above all, to honor that journey. In the end, when I looked at the audience and felt that ocean of people, I thought of the girl reciting in church, and I could almost hear the echo of that past saying, "You made it out." But I also thought, now you need to learn how to stay. Because closing such a big cycle is like leaving a noise and entering a silence, and silence can be scary when you've lived decades surrounded by applause. But I wasn't going into nothingness. I was going into a huge, risky, new project, the creation and consolidation of my own channel. Oprah Winfrey Network started in 2011, and I'll tell you honestly, it was one of the biggest professional challenges of my life. A lot of people thought it would automatically be a success just because it had my name, but media doesn't work like that. You don't buy audience trust just with reputation. You need to deliver content, consistency, vision. In the early days, there were difficulties, adjustments, decisions I needed to make firmly. There were people rooting against it. There were people saying, she's finally going to fall. And I remember a tough meeting, numbers on the screen, a tense team. Someone said in a low tone, "We are suffering, Oprah." And I answered, looking the room in the eye, "Then we are going to learn. I am not afraid to learn in public." I always said, I am not the woman who never failed. I am the woman who learned not to quit when she fails. Over time, the channel found its identity, and I learned to lead in a different way than I led a daily talk show. A channel demands strategy, patience, a huge team, long-term decisions, and I matured in that. At the same time, I kept telling stories outside of daily TV, productions, documentaries, movies, acting roles, projects I chose more for the message than for the fame. I acted in films and productions that spoke of history, of struggle, of family, of trauma, of hope. And every role was, in some way, a mirror of something I saw in the world. And I also lived moments where my voice was called beyond entertainment. One of them was in 2018, when I went up on an award stage and spoke about time, truth, and hope. I felt the symbolic weight of that moment. It wasn't just a speech. It was a sign that the culture was thirsty for courage and integrity. But let me tell you a less glamorous side. Behind every historic moment, there is a person with ordinary days. I also wake up tired. I also have insecurities. I also have losses. I lost important people. My mother died in 2018. My father died in 2022. And when you lose your parents, even being an adult, something in you goes back to being a child, goes back to wanting comfort, goes back to wanting to ask, did I do it right? Did I honor you? I remember thinking about my father, about the rules, the focus, the discipline, and feeling a deep gratitude because in his own way, he saved me. And speaking of saving, I also needed to learn to save myself from myself, especially regarding my body and shame. For many years, I lived exposed to public judgment because of my weight. It was as if the world had decided I needed to prove my worth by a scale. It reached a point where I said, enough. I started talking about health in a more mature way. I stopped pretending everything was willpower. I learned more about genetics, metabolism, emotions, and started accepting that I didn't need to live punishing myself. I was linked for years to Weight Watchers, and then, in 2024, I decided to leave the board and donate my shares because I didn't want anyone saying I was making any health choice for financial interest. I wanted peace, transparency, coherence. And I spoke publicly, too, about using prescription medication as a health maintenance tool without shame. Because I was tired of the theater of suffering, tired of suffer to deserve. I wanted to live with more truth. There was an intimate conversation with a friend, one of those conversations where you aren't performing, and I vented, I spent too much time punishing myself. And she answered, then start treating yourself like you would treat a girl you love. And that got me, because I treated so many people with compassion, and for years treated myself like an enemy. With the arrival of the pandemic in 2020, I also felt a huge responsibility. The world was scared, confused, isolated, and I went back to the special conversation format, not as the daily host, but as someone trying to help make sense of the chaos. I listened to doctors, experts, ordinary people. I tried to create space for information and calm, because I know that when the world shakes, the mind needs ground. In the following years, I kept doing special projects, selected interviews, deep conversations. I started choosing more, saying no more easily, saying yes only when I felt the yes had a soul. And there was a recent moment, already in this phase where technology became the center of everything, when I found myself facing another kind of gigantic topic: artificial intelligence. I participated in and produced a special to try to translate the subject for ordinary people, so everyone understood that the future isn't someone else's up there, it is ours. And when I looked at that, I thought, I spent my whole life trying to make the complicated become human. This is just one more version of the same calling. And while I did these projects, my personal life went on at a quieter pace than people imagine. I live in a place that, for a long time, was my refuge, a space of nature, of ground, of sky, of calm. I learned to like silence, learned to like a routine without a camera, learned to recognize that the value of life isn't in how much the world sees you, but in how much you see yourself. Gail and I remain friends, those friends who don't need to prove anything. We laugh, we talk for hours, we support each other. And if there is one thing I learned, it's that success without friendship becomes loneliness. Stedman and I continue with our story in our own way, far from the model people want to impose. I never had biological children, but I feel a huge love for young people I accompanied, for girls who grew up with opportunities I helped open. And that, to me, is a form of motherhood too, taking care of the future. Now, looking at everything in perspective, I can see a line that runs through every phase of my life. The poor girl from Mississippi, the wounded teenager trying to survive, the determined young woman discovering her own voice, the woman building a career, the businesswoman learning to have ownership, the communicator discovering purpose, the person trying every day to be more whole. And if you asked me today, Oprah, what is the most important thing you learned? I would say it was this: you don't control what happens to you, but you control what you do with what happens. I turned pain into language, shame into courage, silence into voice. And mainly, I turned the feeling of no one is going to save me into I can rise and I can help others rise too. And there is a scene that sometimes I imagine in my head, not as a fantasy, but as a symbolic closure. I imagine the little Oprah sitting on the edge of a simple bed, holding a book, with a heart full of fear of the world. I approach her as the adult Oprah and say, "You are going to go through things that aren't fair." She looks at me with big eyes and asks, "Will I survive?" And I answer with a calm I wish she had heard back then, "You will. And one day, your voice is going to become a home for a lot of people." And I see that girl breathe a sigh of relief, even without understanding how, because that's how hope works. It doesn't need to explain everything. It just needs to stay. If you made it this far listening to my story, I thank you for accompanying me on this walk. And I'm going to ask you one thing from the heart. Don't treat your life as if it were already written. You can still choose better chapters. And if you like this story and want to hear more stories told like this, with soul and truth, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and jump right into the next content that's there for you. Because sometimes the right story at the right time changes the way we see ourselves.